Resuming our discussion from last lecture, we ended up by pointing out that Syria and Egypt form a union in order to deal with the consequences of the failed coup in 1957. The union lasts from 1957 to around 1960, and it really challenged the Syrians greatly because people like Hourani and Al-Faq really wanted free Egypt and free Syria. These are liberal Democrat individuals. They wanted the Ba'ath Party to become a party of both Egypt and Syria. On the other hand, in Nasser, they really found a very, in some ways, rigid dictator. Nasser was extremely distrustful of party politics, and he had his own coercive system. Therefore, 3 years later, when Syrians realized that the United States threat had subsided, the union became unstuck. There's a kind of a strange twist by a form of a digression that I want to mention, because up to this point I've been painting the picture of the United States being anti-Ba'ath and anti-coalition, and they were trying to pull the coup. But there was this strange twist in that in 1958, for a time we actually became pro-Ba'ath Party, not in Syria but in Iraq. And I will discuss that when we get to Iraq. We went from actually seeing Ba'ath as an appendage of Soviet Union in 1957 to one that we actually found useful and ended up supporting. And therefore, in the process, what happened was that at the same time that we were concerned about the Ba'ath Party in Syria, in Iraq we were actually supporting it. Next, I'd like to discuss the process by which this dominant party, the Ba'ath Party, evolved from Aflaq's liberal ideology into what I could call an illiberal, monopolistic, and a careerist kind of an organ of the government. And I want to trace that evolution in terms of the consequences of the failed coup attempt, consequences of attempt to covertly engineer the politics of another society. If you look at this slide, looking at Syria after the failed coup, the first group would be the traditional, and in the case of Syria, they were all pro-Hashemite people. These people who were looking for a union with Jordan under the leadership of King Jordan, and if the union would have also extended to Iraq, which was also ruled by another Hashemite, that would have been acceptable. But look at the shrinking liberal pro-change group. The failed coup, in essence, meant that the percentage of liberal groups had shrunk, in part because the failed coup had discredited some of them. And then the other large group were the authoritarian modernizers that included Nasserites. Some were very leftist and very pro-Nasser. And there were the communists and then the Akhwanis. These were all people that wanted change. They were pro-change. Of course, the direction of change for the Akhwanis was different than the one for the communists, but they were all for change. So, given the above picture, if we have a free election, it would be very difficult for the Ba'ath Party to win because of so many other groups and the shrinkage of the liberal group. Therefore, if you're a Ba'ath leader, you need to make an alliance. And the alliance that they decided to make with is going to be with the military officers. Why military officers? Well, the truth of the matter was that the Ba'ath Party had a great appeal to many minority youths, especially those living in the rural areas. The party offered them a good venue to pursue and advance their careers. So as the Ba'ath Party begins to drift toward an alliance with the military, you pretty much know that there eventually is going to be a change in Ba'ath leadership. So I want to chronicle and trace that change in the Ba'ath Party leadership. In 1947, we noticed that Aflaq and Bitar founded the party. 1952, there was this merger between Ba'ath and the Arab Socialist Party with Akram Hourani. And then 1963, Ba'ath Party actually comes to power and remains in power. If it wants to remain in power, obviously, it needs to bring in the military to be able to provide the necessary support and coercive backing. But remember that whenever you align yourself with the military, it's a double-edged sword. So as the Ba'ath Party began to drift toward alliance with the military in order to stay in power, there will be a predictable changes in the leadership. And by 1966, the military now takes over the leadership of the party. Salah Jadid becomes the first military ruler in this, after this period when Ba'ath began to dominate the politics. Jadid was very leftist and extremely nationalist. The leftist youth, especially those in the university, really loved him. This continues until 1970. 1970, Hafiz al-Assad, the father of the Bashar al-Assad, ends up overthrowing Jadid during the 1970 Black September crisis, which we discussed. And in 1971, Hafiz al-Assad becomes the new president. Again, the ruler of, the leader of the Ba'ath Party. You may recall the month of Black September as being a very, very critical month in Arab history. During that period, King Hussein tries to save his kingdom, and the only way he could do it was by smashing the challenge posed by the Palestinian. Jadid decides to support the Palestinian against the king, and so he sends his tanks, pretending as if they were being driven by Palestinians, but were actually manned by Syrians. So with the Syrian tanks coming to the help of the Palestinian, it looks like King Hussein is going to get defeated. But then all of a sudden, Assad was the Air Force commander at the time, and he refused to give air cover to the Syrian tanks. With this development, Jordan was able to effectively take on the Syrian tanks with its small air force and demolished it. So the question is, why did Assad refuse to give air cover to his own army tanks? And the reason I pose this question, because it's a good point to introduce something about strategic calculus of Hafiz al-Assad, because in many ways he was a very smart strategist. So why did Assad refuse to give air cover to the Syrian tanks? The answer to this question was that this was really a critical moment in international politics. And when I say critical, I mean one in which potentially could have started World War III. As I said, Assad was a very smart, calculating man who understood power and who understood power asymmetry very well and had a good grasp of the situation. If it had looked as if King Hussein was going to get defeated and lose to the Palestinian, in all likelihood, Israel would have preempted and would have intervened, and there would have been a battle with the Syrian tanks, which would have brought in Syria, and it would have surely been spelling the defeat of Syria at the hand of the Israelis. So it was that kind of a scenario that Assad wanted to prevent. In short, had he supported the Syrian tanks with air cover, he could have found himself in a war that he could have ended up being defeated. Therefore, for that reason, he decided to pull a coup and not to give air support to the Syrian tanks. In 1971, therefore, Hafez al-Assad takes over the leadership of the Ba'ath Party, and then finally the last individual is his son Bashar al-Assad, who succeeds his father in 2000. Okay, next I want to go and discuss the control system by Assad. And I've chosen the last 10 years of his rule because there really wasn't that much of a difference in the prior year. So using the familiar, by now hopefully familiar, diagram of primary, secondary, and tertiary control model, at the primary level is coercion. This was a coercive system. It was a system deeply entrenched in the power structure that was put in place by Hafez al-Assad, the father of Bashar. Assad's secret police were all over, and if you were a foreigner visiting the area, you would be followed everywhere by them, and they were always aware of your presence. The main targets of coercion were the secular opposition and the Islamists. So those were the two main targets of it. Some of these secular opposition also belonged to the Ba'ath Party of Iraq, or they were sympathetic to the Ba'ath Party of Iraq as opposed to the Ba'ath Party of Syria. At the secondary level is normative habitual, and normative habitual here, when it's at the secondary level with the coercion at the primary level, it simply means that there is a prevailing sense of resignation on the part of the masses. They believe the system is entrenched, it's very difficult to change it, and so there really is very little hope. The only possibility of change would be another coup by the army, but a system like that is not going to fall easily. And you have seen this in Syria today, even though it's a minority government, the coercive apparatus of a state is so powerful that even though the majority is fighting, it still is surviving. And in some sense, they have managed to regain some grounds against the opposition groups in 2013. So when you put NH at that level below, at the secondary level, but combined with coercion, it means there is very little hope for change. The utilitarian is slightly below secondary. It is not as high as where the government would want it to be. And in this sense, it signifies the fact that Syria was and is relatively poor country compared to its other Arab sisters. And it's not getting much by way of subsidies from the rich Arab states as other countries are getting. And so that's why I've added the arrow. It's instead of going up, it's really even getting worse. Finally, normative active is at the secondary level as well. And basically what that means is that it is working for some. That is, some of the people, especially the Christians and Alawite, do see Arab nationalist potential in Hafiz al-Assad, but the fact that it is not at 1 and it stays at slightly below secondary, it indicates that it is not working for all, especially Sunnis. Also, his record is checkered as far as Arab nationalism is concerned. He did not, after all, support the Palestinian during the 1970 Black September. He supported King Hussein. During the Lebanese war, initially he supported the Christian, not the Palestinian. And also during Iran-Iraq war, NA, that is the normative active, a measure of nationalistic identification, went even further down, or it was eroded for Assad, because he ended up siding with Iran, a non-Arab, against another Arab, Iraq. And remember, Saddam and Assad were enemies, and the Iraqi Ba'ath versus the Syrian Ba'ath were instrument of fighting for each of these two leaders. So that means at the tertiary level, there really is not much there. So the control system that Assad was able to install pretty much remained the same, and a lot of this also applies to his son Bashar, although when we get to the discussion of his rule, you will see that initially there was some opening, there was some sort of glasnost, but later on it went back to this model. Although the position of NA and NH varies for him.